Thank you so much, everyone. No pressure or anything with that introduction. We're just supposed to solve all of the problems and learn to get along by the end of the night. I think we can manage that, right? It's fantastic to be here in this beautiful state, for one thing. I never get to see the mountains. I only get to see the draft in front of me. That's a nice change of pace. I promise you, I am not part of the invading army of Hollywood hipsters for Sundance. So that's probably a relief. Thank you. As you've just heard, I'll echo a couple of those thanks. It means a lot to me whenever anyone supports the arts and supports students and supports journalism, and all of those wonderful things are wrapped up in the Talitha E. Lindquist College of the Arts and Humanities and the wonderful family members here from the Browning family today. The culture of philanthropy here is something that I've been really moved by. And it's clearly inspiring a lot of great students here to pick up the baton and do good, important work. As you may have concluded from that introduction, I am very tired. I am so tired that when the president called Chuck Todd a sleeping son of a bitch, I just felt jealous, honestly. I just wanted a nap. But seriously, it was an honor this past year to have the opportunity to be part of a community of reporters banging their heads against the wall, trying to make sure there's a spotlight on the truth, and to be able to crack a series of stories thanks to brave sources who risked a lot, and thanks to brave activists who continue to make sure that there is change mobilized around those stories. And to have those stories come to the fore after so much adversity, and to see the change that's happening right now has been one of the great privileges of my life. Again, it's not just me, it's a community around the world. I've been privileged enough now to travel and see everything from frustrated members of news outlets that are under the thumb of totalitarian regimes to students at student newspapers trying to engage in breaking the dam here. And we've seen follow-on movements around the world as a result. We are grappling in all of our cultures with our collective failure to create a space that respects people equally, that treats men and women alike with dignity. And we're learning a lot about how powerful men who acted with impunity for a very long time did despicable things and covered it up. My hope is that this next generation of students that I talked to today are going to play a huge part in continuing that trend and making sure we don't slide back to a culture of impunity and a lack of accountability. Now, I know that hearing an introduction like the one that I just got, as generous as the one I just got, it can all seem a little neat and tidy. Like, at every step on this journey, it was all tied up with a ribbon, and I knew that the end point was going to be standing here with you guys talking about how great the work is in retrospect. That's how we're introduced as speakers at events like this or in the media. And sometimes that can be all you see, and it can seem unreachable in some way. So I want to take a moment to talk about how that is absolutely not what it feels like when you're in the midst of reporting stories like this. And how, just as much as the student journalists I talked to here today, I faced uncertainty, and I had no idea if I was making the right call over and over again. I'm still tackling tough stories, and they involve some pretty unsavory characters, so I'm grateful every time I get a generous introduction like that, let's be clear. I need all the help I can get. But I wanted to emphasize that there's more to the story, and it probably doesn't feel that different from what each of you have gone through a version of. I've talked a little bit publicly about some of the challenges that I faced just in getting these stories to see the light of day, how systems commanded by those powerful people that I mentioned came crashing down on me as well, and how people I trusted turned on me, and forces in the media that I thought were instruments of truth-telling became instruments of suppression. And I get asked about that story a lot, and you have a tough interviewer coming on stage in a few minutes, and I'm sure I'll get some questions and dodge them. They're good questions, they're important ones, and there'll be more to say about that in time. Those are vast systems that conspired to keep reporting on sexual violence and a whole range of other tough issues silent for far too long. But again, that's not quite the story I want to tell today. I want to talk about something that is simpler and a little bit more personal. something that, without a doubt, each and every one of you has experienced your own version of, or will experience your own version of in the coming years if you're one of the students here. It's a story that could happen to a journalist, but it's also a story that could happen to an engineer, or a foreman, or a teacher, or a doctor, or a professor or minor. The reality is, I wasn't celebrated in the way you just heard when I set about breaking these stories. I was a guy doing a job at a time when not that many people thought that I was going to be a success story. And I don't say that for any sympathy. I had tremendous opportunities at various points in my life. I did work I was proud of, and I don't take it for granted. But the reality is my career was also on the rocks. And as a result of my tackling these stories that you just heard about, as doggedly as I did, things fell apart almost completely for me professionally. There was a moment just over a year ago when I didn't have the institutional support of my news organization, my contract was ending, and when I refused to stop work on a story and cancel interviews around it, I didn't have a new contract. My book publisher dropped me, refusing to take a look at a single page of a manuscript I'd been working on for years. I found out that another news outlet was racing to scoop me on the Weinstein story, and I knew I was falling behind. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to report that story, or if a year or more of work would amount to nothing. I didn't know if I was going to let down those brave sources, woman after woman that had gone out on a limb to try to expose this thing. I had moved out of my home because I was being followed. I was being threatened. I was facing both legal threats and threats of a more existential nature. There was a powerful, wealthy man who said he was going to use the best lawyers in the country to wipe me out financially and destroy my future. And if against all odds I got through all of that and found a way to publish the story I was working on, I didn't know if anyone would care. Because I had spent a year in a room with executives who had told me this just wasn't a story, that it was never something that would command the kind of attention it commands today. And that wasn't always from people who were acting out of malice or evilness. Sometimes it was just people who were looking at the world as it was and making a pragmatic judgment call, because this was before the extraordinary months of conversation we've seen and the analysis that's happened and the activism that's happening right now. It was before there was this widespread acknowledgement that the suffering of these women, these sources, mattered. I'm not being falsely humble here. I really was at a moment just over a year ago where I didn't know if I would have a job in journalism in a month or 2 months or ever again. And I wish I could tell you that in that moment I was confident or sure of myself, that I didn't care or I said to hell with it. And maybe if there's a movie of these events someday, there'll be a scene where some actor who's better looking than me sort of sits back and like puts on shades and says, "Over my dead body, I'll stop this reporting." And that actor apparently will be Clint Eastwood, based on that voice I just did. It's not the best casting. The real version, though, didn't look anything like that. The real version was I was heartbroken, and I was scared, and I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing. There were so many people in my ear making such good arguments that this was a mistake. Again, not necessarily the bad guys, and there were plenty of those too telling me to stop, but my family members, people who cared about me, my agents, my bosses, people saying this isn't worth it. You're going to tell one story at the expense of so many others. And they were, again, just being rational in their view. It came to a point where people I trusted were telling me, you have got to stop, you've got to let this go. This is causing too many speed bumps for your career. And people were telling me I was putting that whole career on the line for a story that might not even make a dent. And I seriously considered those perspectives, I've got to be honest, because I felt, well, what do I know? There was a low point in the middle of that where I hadn't slept, and I had lost a ton of weight, and I was on the phone with a loved one who was being very patient and dealt with a lot of very annoying calls in that time frame. And I was in a cab going from one meeting with a source to another, and I had just learned that I might get scooped by another publication, and I just fell apart. I was sobbing, and I was trying not to sob, which made it worse, and I'm pretty sure there was like a lot of snot happening. It was not pretty. And I remember saying, I swung too wide, I gambled too much, I've lost everything. No one's even gonna know that I ever did this thing. And he said, okay, we're gonna talk about this. But first you're gonna tip this taxi driver really well. And the driver's name was Omar, and he was very patient, so thanks to Omar. In the end, I didn't stop because I didn't think I was gonna be able to live with myself if I let down all of these women who had put so much more on the line than I was putting on the line. But also, less nobly, I really had gambled too much, and there was no way out at that point but through. But I did start to think maybe I made a mistake. And that's my point here. In hindsight, you always know if your choices were the right ones. In hindsight, you know if you should stick to your guns or turn the other cheek. You know if it was right to continue with the story or maybe just to give a little to get along and move on. Not because you're a coward, but because there are other stories and you don't want to jeopardize them. And there's only so much you can do. In the moment, you don't know any of those answers. In the moment, you don't know if you're fighting because you're right, or if you're fighting because of your ego, or your desire to win, or your notion of yourself as a hero in your own story. Now, whether my judgment was clouded or not, I did have a feeling. I had an instinct. I had a gut reaction, a little inner voice that told me this was the right thing to do. And even when you can't be sure, I think each of you will have that little voice, that gut reaction telling you when it's wrong to stop. I am so grateful for every single person who stared down that kind of adversity and uncertainty, and far worse than I ever dealt with, and listened to that voice and kept going to do the right thing, even if it wasn't clear it was smart or strategic. People like some of the student journalists I just talked to at the Signpost, who just told me about work they're doing to champion tough stories. That's happening every day, right here on this campus. And they do it even when it means going up against the government, against the status quo. I just heard about efforts to report on criminal justice problems, efforts to keep their student government meetings open and transparent to the public. These are tough topics to challenge, and they're happening every day here, those tough conversations. You don't need to look very far to see exactly what that can amount to. Jessica Miller, who you just heard about, I think is here, won a Pulitzer not long after graduating from this very institution. And that's all a result of keeping going and not letting the story die. And all of the people who support and mentor that, the wonderful professors I've met, the families who have given to make sure these programs are in place for student journalists are a part of that. There are wonderful profiles in courage in this community and in this faculty, like Forrest C. Crawford, the professor of teacher education here on campus, who I've been reading about, who had this incredible story of facing adversity, pushing for diversity long before I was around to do anything like this, championing LGBTQ rights in a context where it's often tough. These stories all have lessons for us. And those people in the Weber community who stood up are ones that I will have inspiring me as I try to keep the fight going in anything that I confront. We have a culture that we are all set against now, where taking the easy way out is sometimes an overwhelming, compelling temptation. A culture that tries to tip the scales in favor of getting paid rather than protesting, that tells us to kill the story instead of poking the bear. A culture that says, don't trust that voice that tells you to stay in the fight. And the reason the culture sends us that message is we do look around and we see some people taking the easy way out, doing the immoral thing or the selfish thing, and being rewarded. And it's easy to conclude that's just the way the world works. That's one reason why the kind of diversity you have on this campus is so valuable. You've got first-generation college students. You've got new perspectives coming in and saying, you know what, we're not going to be beholden to the establishment. This is worth a fight. We need the change. So here's what I would say to you. No matter what you choose to do for the students here, no matter what direction you go in, whether you're a doctor treating refugees a few years down the line from now, or a financier making money off of foreclosures, and I sincerely hope you don't do that, you will face a moment in your career where you have absolutely no idea what to do, and where it's going to be totally unclear to you what the right thing is for you, for your family, for your community. And I hope that in that moment, you'll be generous with yourself and trust that voice telling you to stay in the fight. Because more than ever, we need people who are guided by that kind of a voice, by their sense of principle, not by the whims of a culture that prizes ambition and sensationalism and celebrity and vulgarity and doing whatever it takes to win. And I think if enough people, like the students I've talked to on this campus, listen to that voice when they hit that point, if enough of you prove that this next generation isn't going to make the same ones that the previous generation made, then doing the right thing isn't going to seem as aberrational or rare or hard or special. Again, no pressure or anything. All right, so I think we're going to have a Q&A with a tough journalist who's going to ask me about a lot of tough things I'm going to dodge. And I so appreciate you all taking the time and caring. Thank you.
I think there may be a connection between Ronan Farrow's extraordinary reporting on sexual assault by powerful men and his book about the decline of diplomacy in American foreign policy. They're both, you could say, about the importance of principled people coming forward to protect victims, even when it's not expedient. In Farrow's book, War on Peace, he profiles the American diplomat Richard Holbrooke. In fact, he calls him the emotional backbone to the book. Farrow worked with Holbrooke when he was a State Department official, and he said, part of what Holbrooke taught him was that you have to fight to take a stand. No matter what adversity you face, you have to take that adversity and turn it toward the world, to educate others and to right wrongs. And this was something Farrow understood very early in his life. We'll talk a little bit about his remarkable family tonight. His many siblings, many who face physical disabilities and come from countries challenged by deprivation and corruption. And Farrow has said seeing all of these problems and needs right there at his kitchen table made him think, okay, what are you going to do about it? Welcome back, Ronan Farrow.
Are you tired of me yet?
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to begin in Frog Hollow.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people think of you as a New York City kid. But I think it seems like you were more influenced, at least in those early days, by the Connecticut countryside. So I wanted to ask you about that, about the influence of kind of rural countryside and the creatures that were there, because that seemed to have had an influence on you.
Yeah, I rarely get asked about that. I feel like much more of a country boy than a city one. And from an early age, my kind of animating curiosity was about the countryside. It was turning over rocks to look at worms and pill bugs. I had a room that was so full of amphibians, it was like, a Bond villain's lair. I had just tanks of sort of murky fluids and lots of salamanders, and I would mail order things like mud puppies, which you can mail order if you find the right, academic biological supply catalogs. And my poor mom was politely tolerant of all of this, up to the point at which I was secretly raising chickens. I had saved up allowance money to get an incubator and started hatching them, and they were in a guinea pig cage. And it didn't take long for her to realize these weren't guinea pigs. And also there were maggots on the ceiling. So we ended up getting a chicken coop and putting them outside. That was finally where she put her foot down. But yeah, it was a setting that fueled a lot of curiosity. I was a digger from an early age.
That made me wonder why it wasn't a biology that you chose to study.
It was. I was pre-med.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
So you made a shift at some point.
Yeah, I think I wasn't smart enough for it. I mean, I don't mean to laugh as if that's a silly statement. I really did feel like the A's were coming easier on the other stuff. So like so many lawyers, I hit organic chemistry and said, I think I'll be a lawyer. In every lawyer, there's a failed doctor.
I read I read in one profile that you, when you were, people who saw you as a kid, they saw that you had this wicked sense of humor, but also that this was the terms that I read. You were watchful. You were an old soul. Diane Sawyer said that.
That's pretty good from Diane Sawyer. I love Diane Sawyer. Earlier in the group of honor students and journalism students that I was talking to, who had incredible questions, as the best student journalists always do, someone asked, what inspired you to go into journalism, and actually, I think Diane was part of the iconography of what I identified with in journalism, because she was someone who was commanding and trusted, particularly at the peak of that format of network news, and sort of dynamic and alluring, but also tough and serious. She could charm you into a tough question and then just really go in for the kill.
Yeah, she was good at that.
Yeah. So I loved that. I of all the figures that I look at, I would flatter myself by saying, maybe I could do a little of that.
I think the fact that she found you watchful was interesting to me, because there's something that Ken Aletta said of The New Yorker as well about you was observant and patient, and I'm just trying to get at the gift or the skill that you had to get people who were going to have a very difficult time revealing incredibly difficult things. Like, what was that? How did you get them to trust you? I mean, it seemed like that was an important part of it, and I'm just wondering if that goes back to some sense of observance that you had early in life.
Well, I think I'm driven partly by a yawning chasm of neediness. Like I think many people who wind up living some kind of a public life, perhaps even like yourself. I wouldn't presume to say. And I think part of that results in me being a people pleaser. I care what people think. I'm affected by it. I try to tune into any other person I encounter and sort of determine what makes them tick, and that's both a matter of sort of that kind of an outward-facing personality, and also part of what I'm passionate and curious about. I like to get to the bottom of what makes someone hum and what they care about. And I think that for these kinds of stories that are so much about building trust with sources, some of those traits do come in handy. I don't think they're necessarily good traits in all contexts, but going into a conversation with a profound openness to listening, really hearing someone on something that maybe they haven't ever fully felt heard about before, and respecting them enough to give them some space as well, and realizing it's going to take time and it's not all going to happen at once, because you're putting yourself in their shoes and realizing maybe you would also take your time, and ultimately letting them control their own destiny as we would probably each want for ourselves if we were there. There were many cases in the body of reporting that I've done where people said, after many conversations, I'm not going to do this. Yeah. And that's often a crushing blow, because sometimes it adversely affects a whole lot of other people. It means that you can't unveil something that really needs unveiling. But in each of those cases, I've made the tough call to just respect it, and you give up the scoop to make sure you're abiding by someone's wishes.
Well, you've talked about the importance of transparency, saying to them, I really want you to talk to me, but this is going to be really difficult.
Yeah, part of building trust in any relationship is putting your cards on the table, honestly. So, I always try to say very early on, this is my role in this conversation. This is what I want as a self-interested, reporter who wants to break the story. But also separate from that, to the best of my ability to put myself in your shoes, here's kind of what advice I can give, maybe, from having worked with people who are in this kind of a bind before.
Yeah.
And, I can't claim to have any magic power there, or any answer to how you get someone to open up about something that difficult. I've been really fortunate to work with sources that found it in themselves to have a whole lot of strength.
I promise not to continue to psychoanalyze you, but I just am really interested.
See, that's a
in-
lie.
That is. I mean, I think most people know you have, I think it's 10 adopted siblings, many of whom, as I mentioned in the introduction, come from these disadvantaged countries who struggle with physical and developmental challenges. And you've said it was difficult to be self-centered in that family. I'm just wondering if that's your sense of empathy in some way you can trace back to that as well.
I do think so. I mean, I think it's a combination of having seen people with far greater challenges than my own and cared about those people from a very early stage in life. And then just growing up in that kind of a frenzy that anyone in this room with a big family will know very well. You rapidly know that it's not about you, and you can separate out your own self-interest and hopefully the greater good, and also what each of those other people care about.
Yeah.
And the other part of it was I was really lucky to be raised by a mom who had a really strong spirit of public service, and is just a profoundly good human being, honestly, and made far greater sacrifices than I think I'd ever have the strength to make to stand up for her family and have the kind of family that she did. And that was a wonderful example and a tough act to follow.
The dean mentioned getting your college degree at 15, being accepted at Yale at 16, I think it was. And you've talked about this as kind of your Doogie Howser phase.
Only not a doctor, so less impressive.
Exactly. But I'm curious about what it is that inspired you and drove you in those days. I mean, beyond just being pretty smart, I'm wondering what was it your parents were famous, and I'm wondering if there was part of you that wanted to get out from under that. I mean,
very much so.
Really?
I mean, I think most people who are both ambitious, on the crass side of the spectrum, and also care about the seriousness of the work they're doing on the more noble side of the spectrum, do want to get out from under that shadow and experience a degree of frustration at constantly having work you find meaningful linked back to that. But honestly, I also have enough perspective to know that I had wonderful opportunities because of that.
Yeah.
That profile is a double-edged sword. It can be painful to be overexposed in that way, and there's plenty of trauma and difficult things in my past, but also I'm overwhelmingly grateful for all the opportunities that I've had.
At what point were you aware that your parents were famous? And not only that, but that there was this really ugly tension that the world wanted to know about, that these...
Yeah, always. I mean, I grew up
Really?
in that crucible, so that was a fundamental part of my childhood.
How did you react to that, in the sense that, did that also inform the way you wanted to just do something else?
I mean, I think I ran far away from it, and one of the funny things about this particular evolution of my investigative reporting is it sort of came back home to some of those same issues, and involved me, self-searching and overcoming my desire to run away from all that.
I have to say, I thought that having experienced media intrusion throughout your childhood, like in an incredibly intense way, makes me confused about why you wanted to be in the media, why you wanted to be a journalist.
Well, a lot of my work as a journalist is about exposing the bad things the media does, too.
Yeah.
I mean, I broke the
So
story.
that informs the way you think about your coverage.
I don't know that it's that direct a link. I never had that thought while I was working on, say, the stories about the National Enquirer, killing stories for Trump. But I have been drawn to those stories, or the way the National Enquirer was also doing the same work for Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah.
I definitely think that while I believe in the extraordinary and indispensable capacity for good in the media, and I am constantly reminded of the fact that it is the one constitutionally protected profession that we have, that it's necessary if we want transparency and accountability in our structures of power. I also am aware of how defending that institution is partly about exposing what's wrong with it.
Yeah. You've been really candid about the way you have evolved in thinking about the coverage of sexual assault stories. I wanted to ask you about, this was in 2014, and you've talked about how you were preparing for an interview with a journalist who had written this biography about Bill Cosby. The thing is, he had not included in his book the allegations of rape and sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
And you wanted to know why. I mean, you were digging into that. And now this was in the very early days of those allegations, but you wanted to bring it up. And he didn't want you to.
Mm-hmm.
And so you made this compromise in the interview you've talked about. And you said you were ashamed of that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind talking about that?
Not at all. So, I had been covering issues around sexual violence on college campuses and covering the Cosby case, from the moment it became a matter of national concern. But there was a kind of limbo period where those allegations were out there, but it was considered impolitic to raise them on air. And there were kind of old school network voices saying, you can't bring that up. That's not an appropriate question. It's not in the headlines, so it's going to be weird, and you're going to ambush this guy. And I said, okay, well, I'm happy to tell him, but I'm going to ask. And then there was this tussle of, producers not wanting it asked, and, me being sort of low on the totem pole. And I shouldn't say low on the totem pole. Actually, a Native American activist came up to me recently and said, don't say that, because low on the totem pole is like a good thing. Like closer to the earth is often,
wow,
that's how the totem poles are rich. I didn't either.
Yeah.
So at the bottom of the pecking order, I guess, a chicken activist will come up to me and tell me that that's wrong. And there were some very kind of established older producers who were saying, this is bad judgment, and you'll learn that eventually. But I was very right, and they were very wrong.
But what about the part where did you compromise in a way you felt like you shouldn't have?
Yeah, it was a small example, but I give that as an example of all of the little myriad ways that we acquiesce to what we take the norms to be. And that's, a small example is not doing an interview where you ask 10 questions about that, but doing an interview where you ask one question because you're compromising. And, a big example is people, I think, are lulled into the same sense of this is just the way things are done when they cut deals to kill stories.
You wrote this, you said, with sexual assault, anything's easier than facing it in full, saying all of it, facing all of the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we're there?
Oh no, I think there's a long way to go, and I'm sure any survivor of any kind of sexual violence in this room would be the first to say that.
The Weinstein story, more than a year of reporting. You talked earlier about that moment of doubt where your career had hit rock bottom, that you had been basically told to stand down, and then you walked into the New Yorker,
mm-hmm.
and they took the piece. What was the difference?
Well, David Remnick has said publicly, he had the goods from square one, and we, knew that this was significant news, but it actually was, nothing at the New Yorker happens quickly. And so it wasn't like an immediate triumphal green light, there was a period where the story was very much in limbo, and that was very frightening. And all I can say is thank God we have great, tough journalistic institutions like the New Yorker that don't bow to pressure and recognize the importance of a tough story even when it's hard to get it out.
Do you remember the moment when, I'm guessing it was David who said, we're going to run this? Do you remember? Because I'm thinking of September when you thought your career was over.
Mm-hmm.
And this piece happens in October.
Yeah.
So what was it like when whoever it was that said, we're going to go with this? it must have seemed like such a relief.
It was a tremendous relief. It changed my life, and I think the lives of a number of the sources in the story. And for all the wonderful color around those scenes, you're just going to have to wait for my book that I should be writing now. I'm on deadline, and I literally need to be writing right now, but I'm procrastinating.
How much of the personal part of the story I think you referred to earlier, your older sister said she was abused by your father when she was 7 years old. Your mother has said she never got a sense that the Weinstein story, any of these stories, were personal for you, that it was just you as a reporter taking on the story. So how much of it was just informed by the personal stuff, and how much of it was just...
I cared about the issue profoundly and recognized its importance. And I think anyone who has people that they care about in their life that has experienced that kind of thing understands the stakes more acutely. But there was no kind of direct factual link beyond that.
I'm interested in the part you've talked about how your family background and that situation made you understand the abuse of power, and how some of the PR efforts by your father taught you about how the press treats powerful men. And the spin machine, like the way it actually works, like these emails that they send to dismantle people's reputations or to raise questions about victims. Like, is that
a lot of my reporting has revolved around this underworld of high-priced lawyers and PR firms and private investigators that are being deployed every day and very often to stamp out stories that are worth hearing about. And that's a pretty ugly set of systems, but there's still very powerful people willing to pay a lot of money for those services. And, there's legitimate applications of a great many of those things, but also one of the things I've been proud to be able to break in this is the illegitimate applications that I would submit go way too far, and I think a lot of the public now thinks are way over the line, happen more frequently than any of us would have liked to think. I mean, I think before I put out those stories, people would have laughed, and in fact, people did laugh when women with allegations said, I suspect, I'm being followed, or there's people with false identities coming after me and secretly recording me. All of that was happening, and all of those are services you can buy if you happen to be rich enough for it.
We have a few questions from students I want to fold into this conversation. Jess Esplin asks this: I think that one of the most challenging aspects of your reporting is convincing sources and others to talk to you about the acts of sexual harassment and assault, and to persuade them to use their name and go on the record. How do you approach and overcome that challenge? You were referring to it a little bit before, but how do you sort of finally approach that challenge? Well,
it's really just, you try to treat people like you'd want to be treated, right? That old maxim. And we talked a little bit about taking time, giving people the space they need to make that decision themselves, being really transparent about what your objective is and what you want and why. You keep the roles really clear. You keep your reporter's notebook out, either literally or metaphorically at all times. And like I said, I've been lucky to deal with some incredibly brave sources who are just people that really inspire me to this day. And all I can do is try to create a safe space where there's a degree of trust and they feel like they're taking that leap hand in hand with someone who's not a friend or an ally, because I'm scrutinizing these claims in a pretty adversarial way, but who is really committed to doing right by them.
That gets to something that you said and you were really adamant about. I wanted you to make this point, that you're not an activist.
Mm-hmm.
You're a reporter, you're not an activist. That's not how you see yourself. This is the quote that stuck out to me. You said, it's completely possible to be both a skeptical, judicious reporter and also create a space for survivors to be heard.
Yeah. I am grateful for and inspired by great activism, and I'm honored when it's brought on by my reporting, or when my reporting can accelerate that, but it's not my part of the job. So I get a lot of questions about, what about this movement or that movement, or, people that are lobbying for change around issues I've reported on. And I think that's outside of the scope of what I do. I can present the facts and hope that people are moved to act on them.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I want to shift gears and talk about this book. What do you love about diplomats? It seems like you love diplomats.
I do love diplomats. I think we live in a time of, some scholars have argued, perpetual war now. War is the norm, not the exception. And there is a misapprehension that in those times of war, we need our diplomats less. I would submit to you and argue in the book that the opposite is true. I think as we put American lives on the line around the world, it becomes ever more essential that we have people who can negotiate our way out of conflicts before it comes to that. And I think we're really shortchanging that very essential part of protecting our national interests.
You begin the book with this story, a diplomat who has a name that seems fake, but it's not, Thomas Countryman.
It's his real name.
That's his real name, and actually the book sort of bookends. It's his big story at the beginning and his story you come back around to at the end. But I wanted to talk about where he is when the book begins. This is in 2017. This is, I think it's 5 days after Donald Trump was elected. And he's about to go, he's been preparing for this really important meeting. He's got one in Rome, he's got one that night when he learns this. Would you tell that story? Because I think this is interesting.
Yeah, Thomas Countryman was the top American arms control official, and he was working on nuclear proliferation issues. He had worked on these issues for decades. He's exactly the kind of expert that we need as we barrel into these complicated questions of nuclear proliferation around North Korea and Iran. And he was on a mission, as you said, headed into a meeting negotiating with a bunch of different countries trying to create a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East, which is a very thorny, complicated issue, but very important work. And he's heading into that meeting with other countries and just gets the call saying, you're fired. Pack up your things, go. And he's like, well, what, do I do these meetings? Do I not do these meetings? Setting aside the fact that this is a 30-year career that just suddenly is done. And the reality is, he did the meetings and said, this is my last day as an American diplomat. And what ensued was more than a year of simply not having anyone in that job. And I used that story to bookend War on Peace because all over American diplomacy, that story was playing out over and over again. Thousands of diplomats got fired really unceremoniously and in a way that, showed a lack of respect for the kind of serious work that these people do and the sacrifices they make for our country all over the world. These are the men and women who are the first line of defense when bad guys try to get in. They're doing the visa interviews, they're controlling the flow into this country. They are the negotiators who can spare us conflicts that cost American lives. They're the people who step in if you're kidnapped abroad, God forbid, if there's an emergency. And they're our face to the world. They're the sign of American influence in every country. And because we're showing them the door en masse, and we seem to have this flagrant disregard in this particular moment for the kind of expertise that Tom Countryman represented, even on these life or death issues like nuclear proliferation, we're seeing a receding, I think, of America's presence and a diminishing of those important roles that I described.
It's really important, though, to say that, because I think when people hear that, they're going to think, oh, Donald Trump is doing all of this. But the theme of the book is, in fact, it wasn't just Donald Trump. In fact, this goes back.
I was working on the book for 5 years, and it was Donald Trump was, as president, was a twinkle in, I don't know, Roger Stone's eye or something. So Donald Trump for sure brought this to a wild new extreme. I mean, basically didn't have any serious consultations with the existing State Department people in the way that typically there's a transition, and I describe how Colin Powell came in and was so deliberate and thorough about, embedding with the current people and meeting with every bureau to assure them, this is going to be, I'm going to have a respectful handover and I want to continue your policies. And people couldn't believe how it went when Trump came in. I mean, they barely had a transition team. What was nominally the transition team didn't actually talk to anyone at the existing State Department. And the first conversation anyone had with the incoming administration was, in many, many cases, how soon can you leave? Yeah. And then they just didn't fill those positions. So it is, it got called unprecedented a lot, the purge of the State Department, but it's unprecedented as an extreme, but as you point out, a trend line that I was writing about before Trump came along. And I think that's important to note because it's not a right or left issue. It's, Bill Clinton was one of the worst offenders in this. And it really is about moments when we kind of turn inward and become very short-sighted for political gain. Bill Clinton ran on, it's the economy stupid. It was post-Cold War. Did we really need all of this stuff around the world? Let's just focus on domestic issues. And if you look at the testimony from Warren Christopher, Clinton's first Secretary of State, when he went on the Hill and said, we're going to hack away at the budget of the State Department, it sounds almost exactly like Rex Tillerson, Trump's first Secretary of State. These are both moments in our history when politicians decided they could score easy points by denigrating a really important profession.
So you center it on there being a political motivation here. That's when this started to happen. So is that what you've talked about that in the book you write that there's always been a tension between politicians exploiting counterproductive things like nationalism, but this is different. This is new, you think?
It's both. I do talk about some of those early historical examples of the way politicians talked about diplomats as being these kind of stripy pants bureaucrats. Was one popular phrase. Yeah, I don't know why. There was a particularly fun comparison from, I guess, the 1800s of, but these are like cholera vectors. We need to quarantine them when they come back home because they bring back all this foreign ideology. So there is, I trace how our history as a nation has often given short shrift to these very important foreign policy functions, and how it has been a long-standing struggle, but how certain more recent factors, including the political incentives we just talked about, including the rise of the national security state after 9/11, where we have so magnified our focus on being a military power, as these other things withered. Yeah. In some ways, the low that we're at is new.
You tell the story during World War II, the State Department faced a similar kind of crisis that's happening today. But the way they responded was completely different. Tell that story, because I think that seems instructive.
There's a lot of newsprint from that era during and immediately following World War II where they talk about the State Department being useless and needing reform, and it sounds very parallel to what we've experienced in recent history. But the difference that you're referring to is after World War II, we saw this incredible kind of, if there is a golden era of modern American diplomacy, it was probably then. They poured a ton of money into modernizing and restructuring the State Department. They brought in new offices devoted to kind of the rise of mass communication and things like that. They amped up their efforts, and they placed diplomats right at the heart of a bunch of formative conversations that were happening, and the results were the creation of NATO, the creation of the World Bank, incredibly important alliances brokered between, for instance, the United States and the UK, which we still lean on to this day. A lot of this was the work of a cadre of kind of celebrity diplomats that came up in the then brand new Foreign Service in that era.
The book,
the Marshall Plan.
Yeah, of course.
Is a great example.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
The book is, though it's built around these personal profiles. We mentioned Countryman. If you've seen the dude has a mullet.
Yeah. I write a lot about his mullet. Look, anytime for a journalist when you encounter a character with a mullet, it's like, just,
Yes, I've got to write about it. Let's talk about Richard Holbrooke.
But I tried to write respectfully about the mullet.
Yeah, no, you
we
did.
love the mullet.
Wait, what did you say? It was peace in the front,
Yeah, war in the back.
war in the
peace
back.
Yeah. A diplomat's mullet.
Yeah. Richard Holbrooke is you had mentioned, he's sort of the emotional backbone of the story. Talk about when you first met him. You say you described him as vast.
Yes, in keeping with this theme of our once having embraced the idea of the celebrity diplomat, Richard Holbrooke was from another time. He was this, giant personality. He pissed everyone off everywhere he went. He was incredibly difficult. I think I described him as the rare asshole who was worth it.
Right.
He was incredibly brilliant and curious about the world around him, and a real patriot in the sense of the word that so seldom actually gets applied. He believed in the power of America to do good in the world, and he worked his whole life towards that end, from when he was a young diplomat during the Vietnam War and had profound misgivings about how that conflict had been exacerbated by a militarized foreign policy where diplomats weren't being heard, all the way through to Afghanistan, where he died while we were working together. We were in DC, but while we were going back and forth, and he was in vain trying to sound the alarm about that conflict taking on the same contours.
So you guys know Aaron Sorkin's TV shows and films, and your job interview with him was an Aaron Sorkin scene.
I make that comparison.
Yes, you do. I mean, it's amazing, him talking on the phone and taking a shower, and then he goes to take a leak, I think, too.
Yeah. Everyone had stories about Richard Holbrooke following them into bathrooms and stuff, just being completely oblivious, not a Me Too thing, more just he didn't see his surroundings thing.
Right.
Hillary Clinton would talk endlessly, sort of howling with laughter about how he followed her into a ladies' room one time while briefing her on a policy issue in Pakistan. Said it like that, in Pakistan. That's my Hillary.
You said that he started lobbying policy questions to you, that he was looking for non-traditional answers. What did that say, the questions he was giving you, what did that say about the way he thought about policy?
Well, he was a great example of what I mentioned in those remarks earlier of the importance of embracing new ideas and being kind of anti-establishment. He was at once a profoundly establishment figure, right? He was part of this old kind of Clinton-allied guard of foreign policy experts who had been around forever by the time of his death, and was kind of resented by the new Obama administration that had come in. But he was also anti-establishment, I would argue, in that he really wanted to shake up the system, and he had no acquiescence to authority or tradition. He would bring in these sort of radical new voices that had no business being at the State Department, certainly including me. I was straight out of law school, and I was in a role in Afghanistan and Pakistan that had never existed before, doing outreach directly to non-governmental groups, human rights groups and stuff. And there was a whole set of what one senior military guy I quote in the book called Holbrooke's weirdos. We were these, academics and business people and journalists that had come in to try to shake up the strategy in this never-ending war.
The thing that troubled Holbrooke more than anything was that the State Department and diplomacy had been basically militarized. And I wanted to ask you about that. You say that the first time he realized this, or noticed the trend, was back in Vietnam.
Yeah, there's a real parallelism. It's one of the reasons his story is so compelling between what he experienced in his 20s as this wunderkind who headed off to Vietnam to prove himself, and what he experienced during the Obama administration in Afghanistan. And in both cases, he witnessed, these war rooms where generals were basically given free rein to make policy. And he was not a dove. He had supported the invasion of Iraq. I think probably would lived to regret it, but not admit that he regretted it. He understood that the military was the way to get a lot of the things he needed done. His great accomplishment was brokering a peace in Bosnia, and that was very much a diplomatic/military approach. He had NATO strikes waiting in the wings to back up his diplomacy. But I think what he found in both Vietnam and in Afghanistan, two of the great failures of American foreign policy ever, was that the opposite was true, that the diplomacy was secondary or not present at all, and the military was completely in command. And there are a lot of senior Obama administration officials who admit to that in this book. They say, we, in that first administration, really were kind of in the thrall of these celebrity generals.
What's the difference between the way a general would deal with a conflict versus a diplomat?
Well, I want to be careful to include some nuance there. There are plenty of generals who are advocates of diplomacy first. I mean, Jim Mattis famously said over and over again, if you underfund the State Department, I'm going to need to buy more bullets. Because the generals are overfunded and more in the driver's seat, I think they're often the first to see the folly of leaving that imbalance too far out of whack. That said, basically what I'm saying in shorthand is we weren't at these pivotal moments in American history listening to the diplomats and negotiators and peacemakers who naturally, by dint of their assignment and their type of expertise, think in terms of long-term strategy over the decades. Whereas military thinking almost necessarily very often comes back to that shorter frame, what's tactically right for the theater of war kind of thinking. They're thinking about, here are our targets, here are the men I need on the ground, and again, you have this argument seep into these war room conversations of, if I only have, X number of tens of thousands of troops, we can break this thing. And it's never that simple. And you need both kinds of thinking, but you need to empower the long-term strategists, or you end up in Vietnam or in Afghanistan.
So you talked about...
Wow, thank you. You guys are a fantastic crowd. Thank you for caring about our dry foreign policy discussion. Well, there's a lot of American lives on the line.
Absolutely. Well, I was really...
I'm sure many of you have families that have been affected by those conflicts.
Yeah. You write about also the difference between when a general shows up in a fleet of military planes with this big, massive entourage, just the message that sends.
Yes, I think there's real peril in becoming a military first presence around the world, even just in terms of optics. If our negotiating partners around the world perceive the main focus of American power to be the military, they're just going to deal with the military. And I do case studies of countries where that's happened. Places like Pakistan and Egypt, where basically the diplomats don't do anything functional anymore. It's a purely military to military relationship in terms of any meaningful policy that's undertaken.
Holbrooke resigned after Nixon took office for a time. I love these stories of him when he was a 24-year-old punk, basically, asking these impertinent questions of General Westmoreland during Vietnam.
Yeah, he's a great character. I mean, he was so difficult and so entitled, and just nobody could stand the guy, but also everybody loved the guy who could, tolerate him for any length of time. He'd have taken a bullet for any member of his team. I mean, mostly for the good press, but but no, he was profoundly loyal to the people he mentored. And I got to experience that, but also I got to experience him, raging and ripping memos out of my hand so hard that they tore in half and causing his wonderful, gentle Southern secretary at the State Department burst into tears because she watched us fighting, and she was just very upset by this. And he'd say, "Donna, stop crying." Which didn't help.
I think people are going to be, I guess in some ways, disillusioned to hear that Barack Obama really, at least during the first term, accelerated this trend of militarization. As you said, sort of getting a lot of quote-unquote celebrity generals
this is not
on
a
board.
particularly flattering portrait of the Obama administration's foreign policy. But it's one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story. It's so rare that we have an issue that is truly not partisan. And this is one of them. You know, I think sane people on both sides of the aisle understand the crucial importance of supporting our diplomats. And unfortunately, there's plenty of insane people who don't hold that view, also on both sides of the aisle.
You talked to all 9 former secretaries of state, which is remarkable. Henry Kissinger. And I liked your description of George P. Shultz before we get to Kissinger. He was such a grumpy guy, but outspoken, right? I mean, he was great. He sounded it.
I mean, I was about to use a phrase that's a little too off color for tonight, but he gives 0 cares.
He doesn't give a darn.
He doesn't give a darn.
Yeah.
And nor should he, honestly. How is he, 97?
97.
He's 97. God bless that man for taking the time to get on the phone with me. And he sort of at various points would just decide he was tired of the conversation and hang up. And then I'd get his assistant back on the phone, and she'd put him back on and say, "Yes." There's some fantastic characters in here, and as with all of these stories, like I was talking about before, I'm just so grateful anytime anyone bothers to pick up the phone and talk to me. And a lot of them were very generous with their time for this. Also, if you listen to the book on tape, you can hear my impression of Henry Kissinger.
Kissinger saying, if you listen, that this change had happened, not just in the State Department, but he said he was noticing a change in the philosophy of the American people. What did he mean?
You would like that. I can tell. I've got you dead to rights already. He wants to have this be a philosophy class. And I'm down, honestly. He had... Look, Kissinger, I am very forthright about saying, is this incredibly difficult character and, a war criminal by the judgment of many sensible people for what he did to Cambodia. He's also a person with a whole lot of insight. And I think both of those things can coexist. So I'm not at all a Kissinger apologist, but he does say one of the things that I often return to when I think about what I learned from all of those voices, and he talks about the failure to view diplomacy as an historical process in context, something that takes time and expertise. And the triumph of short-term tactical thinking over that long-term strategic thinking. And he marries that with a kind of a commentary on American identity, where he says it's one of the great American myths, I'll always remember this phrase, that you can always try something new. And he said that in the context specifically of the Obama administration not giving proper dues to old diplomats like Richard Holbrooke. But it's a pretty important concept to turn over in this current era where we're basically showing all the experts the door.
You say in the book that the continued dismantling of the State Department under President Trump seems like a logical outcome, but you say it's not inevitable. It seems inevitable to me.
Well, I talk about how the Obama administration went from that first term where the Afghanistan policy review was very much military dominated, and the diplomats involved, like Richard Holbrooke, were trying to wedge their perspectives in there and failed to do so. And then in the second Obama administration. It's kind of a case study in how you can reverse course pretty rapidly. They decided to reprioritize large-scale diplomatic endeavors. You ended up with the Paris Climate Change Accord, the thaw in relations with Cuba, a whole string of pretty rapid diplomatic accomplishments with just a few years of sinking some effort into that. And, I don't consider that a complete victory on any one of those issues, and some of them have been unraveled completely now by the Trump administration. But it does show that while there will be decades, I think, of damage, because you can't immediately restore the flow of new talent that develops over many years into a system like the State Department, you can start quickly and regain some lost ground quickly. So I hope people don't read this book and feel helpless. I hope they read it and feel a matter of urgent need to act now.
I want to come back around to the coverage you've been doing lately. Do you miss this kind of coverage, by the way?
I definitely, I'm going to do a paperback of that at some point, and I should have already, and that publisher is mad, and also my other publisher is mad. I have a lot of book stuff to do, basically, guys.
He said he's going to be writing all night, basically.
So after the book number 2, I am going to return to this, and really, there's an interesting change happening now, and I think it's typical of some of those examples I give of second terms being a little more diplomatic focused. I think the jury's still out in terms of Pompeo and what's going to happen next, but certainly you at least have a greater degree of competency than you had under Tillerson, and there are some signs of promise, maybe. I mean, the kinds of characters I profile in this book are just so desperate for any glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
And I think there is a sense that some degree of normalcy may be returning, even though I think at a White House level, there really hasn't been any sign that they care about these issues. So the answer is yes, I will return to it, and I do miss it.
This is a question that came from Dean Springer. How do you make sure that this shift in consciousness and awareness about powerful men misbehaving and being held to account, how do you make sure that shift becomes a structural feature? I think this is a good question, and not just a passing moment.
Yeah, that is the great question, and I think we all will depend on this next generation of the students who are in the room. We need to keep tough journalism alive and well and strongly resist propaganda from any political party that tries to set the people against the press and vice versa. The press is not the enemy of the people. The free press is one of the great tools and allies of the people. And I see in my generation of journalists so much incredible work happening right now that it can't help but give me hope.
I keep seeing questions about whether or not you'll run for president or you'll run for some sort of elected office. You ever think about that?
I'm flattered by the question, and I said this earlier when I got the same question in the student group, and then I had to say, should I be flattered by the question given what people think of politics right now? The honest answer is no, and that's not one of those answers you always get from ambitious people when they're asked, are they going to run for office? And they say, like, I don't know. I haven't thought about it. Like Hillary Clinton for all eternity saying, maybe I will, or maybe I definitely will. I truly have never harbored that ambition. And I hope that every young person in this room is more open to the idea than I am, because we need good people to go in there and fix the system. We just desperately do.
Yeah. That's a good way to end. Ronan Farrow, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.